Hi everyone and welcome to this tutorial on the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. Tutorial 6 is on analysing poetry. Instead of annotating your anthologies today, we're going to look at the key components that make up a successful comparative paragraph. You'll need your AQA anthologies, exercise books or paper, and if you have one, a previous poetry essay that you could use to make reference to. And of course, you need pens. So I think it's really helpful to take a look at the mark scheme first, because what we want to try and take a look at is what the examiner is expecting from your essay. So at the top band, which is where we're always aiming to achieve, the keywords that we are looking at are, on the left-hand side, the word convincing, critical, and exploration. So when we're thinking about the word convincing, in order to be convincing in anything is to make sure that you're well informed. So your essay requires, in order to be convincing, to have a range of evidence and references to both poems in order to be convincing. Take these words, remember, and apply them to real life, and that's how you get to understand what's required of you. For critical, this is quite heavily linked to your AO2 but also AO3. If you critique something, if you take the word criticise, what you're doing is you're taking your knowledge and you are then picking apart something else. To be critical is not necessarily to say whether or not you like the poem or dislike the poem, but to think about the writer's intentions and whether or not the techniques that they've used have been effective or not in conveying something. And then the exploration. And this comes from how far you can delve into each of the poems, and also in terms of exploring, giving a range. So actually, when you look on the right-hand side at how to arrive at a mark, at the top level, a candidate's response is likely to be a critical, exploratory, well-structured comparison. That word or phrase, well-structured, means that you aren't just giving lots of attention to one poem, but that you are equally giving attention to both poems. It takes a conceptualized approach. If something is conceptualized, it's a concept, it's an idea. We talk about this quite a lot with your literature essays. Lead with one line of argument, and then the whole essay is based around that, and supported by a range of judicious references. In order for a reference to be judicious, in order for your evidence to be judicious, it means that you're able to say a lot about it. So you've really thought about the evidence that you're putting in. There will be a fine-grained and insightful analysis of language and form and structure. Notice that it lists all three, because in order to achieve the top bands, you really do need to make sure that you have looked at not just the imagery, but also the form and structure and how that contributes to. When it says insightful, what this comes from essentially is your ability to not just say the obvious thing about the quotation you've used, but to really consider it. And I've said this before, and I will continue to say it. It's one thing to know the text that you're studying, but to engage with it makes you such a better writer. Have an opinion, okay? Really do think about what you think as well. And then we have this convincing exploration of one or more ideas, perspectives, contextual factors. With the contextual factors, don't be tempted to just drop in a fact. But for example, if you've got one of your poets is a romantic poet, then the contextual influence on their writing could be important to meaning. So for example, when you were looking at Blake and London and this idea of him being heavily influenced by the Industrial Revolution, these kind of things are worth bringing into an analysis. Talking about when it was written, maybe not so much, unless it's important to the point you're trying to make. In terms of perspectives, you come across this word quite a lot in language paper 2. And when you think about it, what we always say is perspective means attitude, opinion, experience. So these are the things that you are looking at. So now I'd like to take a look at some common mistakes. So I've got a paragraph from a student's work here, and all I want us to have a look at is where the strengths are, but also where and I say common mistakes because this isn't the only paragraph that I encountered where a student lost their way. So this is comparing London to My Last Duchess, and the question was about abuse of power. In London, we see use of graphic imagery to link to the power by the government to the monarchy. We see this when Blake says the hapless soldiers sigh, to emphasise the monarchy's complicity in unnecessary bloodshed. This also links to the exasperation of futility in war and how useless it is. From this, we clearly get a sense of abuse of power, as he is in control. However, if he wasn't, he would still make out as if he was. Also from London, we can see imagery of the corrupt government through the use of the metaphor runs in blood down palace walls. This links to My Last Duchess, where Browning uses the metaphor my gift of a 900 years old name, which shows that he sees marriage as a gift and a reason to possess his right over women. From this, we can see the abuse of power is shown clearly, as the men only want to marry women for dominance and control, so they can be seen as the dominant one between the two. Take a look at this now and see if there's anything you would pick out as a common mistake. So first of all, let's take a look at the positives of this paragraph. So we have a clear introduction thesis statement here. Excuse my pen on the screen. In London, we see use of graphic imagery to link to the power by the government to the monarchy. That sounds like a really confident opening. We've got mention here of technical language, which is really, really good. What's also good is further down when looking at My Last Duchess, where Browning uses the metaphor my gift of a 900 years old name. It's accurate. That is a metaphor. So that's a good identification too. We then have a link to the question down here. From this, we can see the abuse of power is shown clearly, as men only want to marry women for dominance and control, so they can be seen as the dominant one between the two. We've got this idea of the contextual factors and ideas of the poem, so that's quite good too. However, what we do have here is, I suppose, a bit of a chaotic paragraph in the sense that not much really matches up. So what you may have noticed, if I just switch my colour here, is that the quotation, the hapless soldier's sigh, doesn't link to the power of government to the monarchy necessarily. And if it does, which you could make the link, it's not explained well enough here to emphasise the monarchy's complicity in unnecessary bloodshed. The key missing part here, and it's the part that I found was missing from a lot of people's, was this word, how. A lot of the time, what you really need to make sure you're doing is explaining how this quotation, this piece of language, this graphic imagery, for example, how does it show what you're saying it shows? The other issue that we then encounter in this is that further down, oh my God, guys, technology is not my friend. Okay, if we just go down, when it comes to the link, and again, really good that this student tries to link. If we section off, she says, if we section off here, so this part of the paragraph is all about London. And the kind of key points from this is that Blake uses graphic imagery, that it's about the monarchy and complicity in unnecessary bloodshed, We get a sense of abuse power as this bit doesn't really make sense, as he is in control. However, if he wasn't, he would still make it out as if he was. And again, a common mistake, getting a bit too carried away. There are so many annotations on our anthologies. They're all there to help you, but don't feel like you have to put them all in unless they're relevant. Okay, so I think a few points are getting mixed up in this first part of the paragraph. But this is where this paragraph for me falls down the most. When it goes into the section on My Last Duchess, it says, this links to My Last Duchess, where Browning uses the metaphor, my gift of a 900-years-old name, which shows that he sees marriage as a gift and a reason to possess his right over women. If this is the link phrase, okay, the bit that links the two poems together, can you see that there's actually no link there? This paragraph is talking about graphic imagery and the monarchy being complicit in unnecessary bloodshed. When you link to your next poem, there are one of two things. Either that it is also showing something about the monarchy being complicit in unnecessary bloodshed, or that it's used graphic imagery. One of those things has to link here, because otherwise they're essentially two separate paragraphs. Hopefully that makes some sense. So what I'd like to do now is to consider where we could have made some changes in this paragraph. So like I said, the graphic imagery, absolutely, that's a tick for me. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to tick the things that I would keep. So I would keep that about the graphic imagery. What I would then do is ensure that the quotation that is put in is actually graphic imagery, which this one isn't. So if we think back to London, the graphic imagery linking to the government and monarchy would be runs in blood down palace walls. I hope some of you who know me are incredibly impressed that I've managed to do that. So if we then insert that quotation, it would now read, in London, we see use of graphic imagery to link to the power by the government to the monarchy. We see this when Blake says, runs in blood down palace walls, to emphasise the monarchy's complicity in unnecessary bloodshed. Do you see how that sentence now makes sense? Because this image here is directly linked to and illustrating the monarchy and their responsibility for bloodshed during the war. So this now makes sense. That means that we have now turned this first part into a clear, so we're in band 4 at the moment, a clear analysis. We then need to think about this next part, and potentially taking that out because it's not necessarily relevant to the quotation. What I want to do, once I've stated, and remember this is the difference, you're stating here to emphasise the monarchy's complicity in unnecessary bloodshed. Okay, but how? And you always want to consider the how after. It's so important. So then I need to think, okay, how does runs in blood down palace walls, the fact that it's graphic, how does that emphasise the monarchy's complicity? Okay, well, I could talk about the idea of palace walls we would associate with cleanliness, maybe purity, maybe hope. So we have something that naturally would have connotations of these things. However, it runs in blood down palace walls, and this runs in blood is the graphic part. And obviously, by having blood running down the palace walls shows that it's almost as if it's like the connotations of blood being death. You could even say something like devil or sin. And the idea then that these palace walls are sullied by the blood that's running down them, it's almost, which we know from Lady Macbeth and guilt on your hands, it's guilt. So then it's that kind of, that would then go here after this sentence, because that would explain how graphic imagery shows this. Okay. Another change that we could make is also just to make sure that our link makes sense. So then I need to consider, okay, is there anything to suggest that the monarchy has complicity in unnecessary bloodshed? Not exactly, because we have a duke, and there's no real talk of war. However, what's something that we know about the duke, or that we surmise about the duke, is that he's potentially killed his last duchess because she didn't do what he wanted her to. So we could potentially talk about the fact that he has blood on his hands, and that's showing this kind of corruption. Remember, we're trying to link to the abuse of power. In London, through runs in blood down palace walls, that abuse of power comes from the monarchy making the country's decisions and essentially allowing men to die for them, potentially unnecessarily. In My Last Duchess, the Duke uses his status and power to essentially control the people around him, and when they can't be controlled or won't be controlled, he abuses that. So actually what I would say is that it's this quotation that is the issue, and this example, because we can't link it. There's not really any graphic imagery. So what we could do here is, rather than this links to My Last Duchess, we could say something like a similar concept is seen in My Last Duchess. We could then talk about the all smiles stop together. So we could talk about insinuation. We could talk about the sinister tone. And we can acknowledge that although Browning doesn't use graphic imagery, he does still convey this sense that those in power, much like the monarchy, are complicit in unnecessary death. So then that would be a link. Even though they've done it completely differently, even though they're completely different perspectives, which again, it's really good to talk about, while they both have completely different perspectives, it's about making sure that there is some link within the paragraph. Okay, so now what I'd really like to show you is a higher level paragraph that achieved quite well, that was just lacking a little bit in order to take it to that top band. So this is the phrase that I want you to remember when you are writing your paragraphs. State, prove, explain, critique. Now, sometimes you won't do it in that order, but generally, if you can check yourself on these 4 things, if you can see where you've stated, then you can see that you've proven that statement, you can see that you've explained how, and then you can critique why, that essentially will really, really help you. And just really, I'll write this and then I'll get rid of it, but some of you will have learned the what, how, why method. This really does link to it. So here is your what. What are you saying in response to the question? This is your how, which means this is your why. So for each poem in the paragraph, you need to make sure you have state, prove, explain, critique in each section, okay? Watch me now try and erase all the ink. Oh my goodness, I'm a genius. Okay, so this is the paragraph that I'm really pleased with. What I want us to really consider when we look at this is the things from the mark scheme from the beginning that we were thinking about. Critical, exploratory, conceptualized. These are the things that we really need to make sure we're showing. And some of that comes from having a confident voice. And I have to say that this student really conveyed a confident voice in their analysis. So I will just show you what I really liked about it. I'll read it through first and then I will highlight. In both London and My Last Duchess, the poets present power to be controlling in a sense that makes the people care for only themselves. They both write about situations where moral judgment is clouded by power, creating solid points about its effect. London speaks about how there is inequality in society, and its name contributes to this as an urban setting with the image of a divided environment. Whether it be through poverty, gender, or status, there is inevitable division in the city. The alliteration marks of weakness, marks of woe creates an image of vulnerability as the noun marks is symbolic of scars and wounds, which arguably are present due to the inequality. In the time the poem was written, it was not questioned for a man to hit a woman, as it was believed to be discipline. At the same time as alliteration, Blake uses syntactic parallelism to emphasise the suffering. So hopefully you can already see a difference between the two students. One is definitely more confident vocabulary-wise, but also statement-wise. So for me, it's that introduction. It's the first two sentences that really set off in both London and My Last Duchess, groups them together straight away. This is really advisable that your first sentence is essentially in response to the question and grouping your two poems together. In both London and My Last Duchess, the poets present power to be controlling, which means that for the rest of this paragraph, whether I'm talking about London or My Last Duchess, what I would do is talk about them showing this power to be controlling. That makes it a lot easier then to talk about, because you know that in your very first sentence, you said what it was you were going to talk about. What we hope for then is that the rest of this paragraph will do that. What I've done is I've only taken the students writing about London because I want to talk about this depth, the state, prove, explain, critique method for when you're analysing your poems. This next sentence, really nice. They both write about situations where moral judgment is clouded by power, creating solid points about its effect. Now, what I would say is, personally, just get my teacher pen out. This here, creating solid points about its effect. Tell me what that's saying, because to me, that's not saying anything. This again is a common mistake that people make. They just try and throw in something. Don't say it. You don't have the time, remember, to make empty statements. But this first part is really good. They both write about situations where moral judgment is clouded by power. So again, not only have I got the idea of controlling, but I'm also talking about moral judgment and being clouded. Okay, so I know that the rest of this paragraph, that if I'm an examiner, that's what I'm looking for this student to talk about. So let's see if this student does. Inequality in society. Well, we could potentially see how that would lead to either controlling or moral judgment, then contributes to urban setting with image of divided environment, whether it be through poverty, gender, or status. There is inevitable division in the city. The alliteration, marks of weakness, marks of woe, creates an image of vulnerability. Okay, so we've run into our first mistake. The student is stating that the alliteration, marks of weakness, marks of woe, creates an image of vulnerability. My question would be, how? Tell me how just having the alliteration of weakness and woe creates an image of vulnerability. It doesn't. Alliteration doesn't create an image. Alliteration generally, because it's a technique to do with sound, is generally to do with tone and feeling and emotion. The student then goes to talk about the noun marks, symbolic of scars and wounds, which arguably are present due to the inequality. That is a great point. It's not that it's not a great point, it's just completely separate to what was just being said. So then we have this discordance in their analysis. Suddenly, this student cannot achieve the top band because their answer isn't conceptualized. In the time the poem was written, it was not questioned for a man to hit a woman. Okay, so we've got a little bit of inaccuracy here for a man to hit a woman. It's not that it wasn't questioned. It's just that that has got nothing to do with this. We don't know if this is a man or a woman, and particularly because it says in every cry and every man. we have no idea where this has come from, really. So again, it's really, really preventing this student from achieving the top marks just because essentially tiny little mistakes that are really easily rectified. At the same time as alliteration, Blake uses syntactic parallelism to emphasise the suffering. And again, my question would be, how on earth does syntactic parallelism emphasise suffering? I know why, because I know that we annotated this in our anthologies. But your job in the essay is not to just make the statements that we make on the annotations. Your job is to then explain. State, prove, explain, critique. So let's see where we can make those improvements. So personally, I really, really love the introduction and I wouldn't want to change it. But the analysis that comes afterwards doesn't really show me controlling or judgments being clouded. So then I need to think about, where is there an image that the poets present power to be controlling in London? Think about control. Look at your poem London and consider, what is that key quotation, that key image that really shows control? It's not that marks of weakness, marks of woe is a bad quotation, but is it showing that people are being controlled or that there is a moral judgment being clouded? Not really. However, for controlling, I could definitely add in the mind-forged manacles, the most powerful image in the poem. For the where moral judgment is clouded by power, I could use the runs in blood down palace walls. I could use either of these. I could use both of them. But what I do need to make sure of is that when I state, I then prove, I then explain, and I then critique. So if I'm going to talk about, let's just talk about controlling, for example. The poet presents power to be controlling. This can be seen through the powerful metaphor, mind-forged manacles. I can then talk about how essentially one's mind should be free. So for it to be in chains shows a disruption to nature or the natural order. I could then say how I could even, if I wanted to, link that to the marks of weakness, the idea of there being physical marks, but also in their mind as well. Therefore, the people in power are controlling everything, and in quite a violent way. To have people's minds in chains is quite a powerful image. Why do I think then, and remember this is your critique, why did Blake want to have this image of minds being in chains? Well, potentially because what he was trying to say about power is that it's abusive and that we are left, if we're not in power, those not in power are suffering, which actually, again, we have this in the final part. So it does all link up. It's just making sure that you do make sure you're linking it up really obviously. And I think that hopefully the state, prove, explain and critique method could really work for you. So key advice for poetry analysis. Obviously, I'm going to put in my little buzz phrase. These might be worth noting down. I apologise for my dodgy handwriting. So state, prove, explain, critique. I'm going to say that just change my colour. Another key piece of advice for poetry analysis is to consider your links before you write. Let's go back. If we think back to that first piece of writing, if the student had taken a breath and thought about graphic imagery and then thought about what they were going to say about graphic imagery in London, they would have then thought, whoa, hold on a second, there's no graphic imagery in My Last Duchess. But we do have this. That will be my link. And then write, that would be really good, which is where your planning does really come in handy. Another thing that I would really advise doing, let me just switcheroo to a different colour, is to link poems together in first sentence of each poem. I think it just makes you sound really confident, but I also think that it helps you to refer back to. A really obvious one, but I did notice this quite a lot in essays I read recently, and that is to make sure you are answering the question. It sounds like a really obvious thing, but it's one of the most common mistakes that people make. Okay, make sure that you've not gone off on too much of a tangent, and that when you are analysing that metaphor or you've zoomed in on that word, that you are thinking about its impact on whatever the question asked. So, for instance, the question was about abuse of power. The student previously was talking about power being controlling and moral judgment clouding. But where was the mention of power being abused? Okay, it's not that it's wrong to point out that power is being controlling, but how does that mean power is being abused? Make the statement. Make sure you are answering that question. And then finally, my final thing that I would suggest is that you summarize the link at the end of the paragraph. You don't have to be generic, and therefore, while one uses metaphor, the other one uses graphic imagery. I don't want you to be like that, but it is worth noting potentially that this summarising at the end is about the message or concept, the why. What were the writers trying to do, and was it similar? So this is what I'm tasking you with doing. I really, really want you to put it into practice, okay? So we're only going to look at one poem, and hopefully before you watch this tutorial, you watched and annotated along with my tutorial on Storm on the Island. So you know Storm on the Island now. Make sure you know it. This is what I'd really like you to do. Answer this question. How does Heaney present nature in Storm on the Island? So what you're considering here is that nature is presented as, okay? And then I want you to think of 3 different adjectives that you would say Heaney presents nature as. So an obvious one is powerful, but I bet there are 2 more that you could find. If you're saying that he presents it as powerful, how do you know that? How can you prove that you know that? And then why? Why does he present it as powerful? This is his key message here, okay? The how is his craft, and the why is the point of it. Poetry was a platform, okay? Still is a platform. It's a way of where people can connect to the politics of the world, with the world around them, and connect to the things that are going on in the time that they live. So then how and why? This is your what. It comes with a quote and a method. The how is that method and its effect, and then